Okay, so welcome everyone to this. I consider this to be part of a Here for Good series that we're going to start producing here at Avondale. But I want to introduce you to a special guest. And Renee, I've got to tell you, I've been very excited about chatting with you because Renee came and visited Avondale probably a month and a half, maybe 6 weeks ago. We actually sat over here and she just told story after story because I kept on asking for more. And I think at the end she thought, well, that guy just asks a lot of questions, but to me it was just fascinating, and I'm sure you guys are going to enjoy hearing from Renee too. So let me just a little bit of introduction. So Associate Professor Renee Bittoun is an internationally recognised expert in smoking cessation. Now I'm assuming, Renee, that doesn't mean that you've ceased smoking more than anyone else in the world?
Personally, you mean?
Yeah.
No.
Good. All right. We're off to a good start.
No.
She's worked.
Never smoked. Mind you, it matters. If people ask you, have you ever smoked, which they do, if you're talking about smoking, does it matter that I've never smoked? I don't think it does. It depends on how you come over, as if you've got some sort of credibility. And because I've done so much work in the field, I seem to have some credibility that it actually doesn't matter.
Yes.
So apropos of that, people do ask, if you're going to talk about smoking, what would you know?
Yes.
You've never smoked.
Well, just to elaborate on your credibility, so she's worked in the field for more than 30 years. She's an inaugural member of the international SRNT, I think it is, which is the International
I'll talk about that too.
For research in nicotine and tobacco. She started one of the world's first smokers clinic in Sydney in Australia in 1979 when I was 9 years old, but I won't remind you of that. So, at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, she is the founder and editor-in-chief of the internationally peer-reviewed Journal of Smoking Cessation, which is published by Cambridge University Press. And I'll tell you what I think you're going to really enjoy tonight. And I thought lots about the things that you were sharing with me. I learned a ton in the time we had together, but I just loved your passion. What I love doing is connecting with capable,
come and listen if you want.
Passionate people. I might just turn Doug off there. I think he...
Sorry. Oh, terribly.
I've got it. I've sorted it now.
Okay, you can mute that if you can.
Okay.
How are we going? We muted? Oh. And there we go. I've got them. And yeah, what I love is these capable, caring, passionate people who are really out to make a difference and change in the world and doing it for all the right reasons. And you just really exemplified that. So it was fantastic hearing from you. So I'm going to hand it over to you mostly, asking some questions. And the first thing I'd love to know is if you can just share a bit of the background. I mean, how did you get started in this smoking cessation space?
Well, I come from a background of respiratory physiology. So spending some of my initiation really into this area with patients with really severe medical consequences of smoking. And I set up, luckily for me, I was able to set up one of the first respiratory function laboratories in Australia at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. This is you ready for this? 1967. That's a while back. And then I went over to St Vincent's Hospital to do the same, to set up respiratory function laboratories. These, if you know them, if our colleagues who are watching this know these facilities, they are extremely expensive setups of, obviously doing blood gases, obviously doing lung volumes, and some of you might know what a body plethysmograph is, where you're measuring total lung volume. And it's really to look at diseases like emphysema and air trapping. This is, at the time, unbelievably expensive equipment, and there I was buying it, and thinking, all this money being spent on such preventable thing, like emphysema is so preventable. This is in the late 60s and early 70s. I'm already knowing this. So it wasn't like it was, a revelation to me, but I certainly knew that it was expensive to set up all this testing for something that was really very preventable. And so I...
Just to jump in there, you talk about being preventable. This is the late 60s. To what extent was there still pushback from, denying the evidence?
You mean from the tobacco companies or from our colleagues?
Even from colleagues, yeah.
Even from colleagues, you'd be surprised. I've just been talking about some colleagues, fairly significant people who were defending on the site and being paid, I might add, by the tobacco industry in the 1980s about lung cancer and smoking. Not 1960s, this is 1980s.
Wow.
Really credible people. So that was really... So earlier it was a bit... I think by then, 1970s, people were pretty well understanding the medical consequences of smoking. Just keep in mind, even Freud knew smoking was bad for your health, and this is 1920. He wrote about it.
Share his Freud story.
The Freud story. Well, I'll just... Okay. Freud is fine. Freud is interesting. Sigmund Freud. This is 1900, 1910. He's smoking, and then, as some of you know, he was a big cigar smoker, very nicotine dependent, Freud was. He would write about how dependent he was. He's written whole tracts about how it helped him concentrate. So Sigmund Freud's writing about this in the 1910, 1915. He develops heart disease, not cancer, heart disease to start with. And his local doctor, cardiologist, said, stop smoking. It's bad for your heart. 1910. So it's not that people didn't know already then there was some cardiovascular effect. Later on, as some of you might know, what happened to Freud? Anybody know what happened to him? He developed a carcinoma of the palate later in life. And then, unfortunately, he had to have quite a lot of surgical procedures. He had, I understand, 17 surgical procedures around his jaw. He had a prosthetic jaw because of it. Yes, it's all horrid, isn't it? And then he had to, which is why he grew a beard to cover all the scars. So here you've got the picture of Freud with his cigar and his beard. Just keep in mind the pain under that would have been horrendous, for which he then took, going on always smoking cigars. So the initial problem has always been his nicotine addiction. And he went on to, unfortunately, need quite a significant amount of painkillers. And so he developed a dependence on painkillers, on morphine. Some of you might know that too about Freud. So ironically, what started this all off was his nicotine addiction, which he had all his life, and he never stopped smoking cigars.
So you're now seeing, these conditions come through thick and fast, increasing prevalence.
Yes. Especially then in those days, we saw a lot of COPD, a lot of, respiratory consequences of smoking. And I'd be stomping around going, this is dreadful, this is so preventable, and carrying on as I do. And I was saying that to a colleague who said, well, you've got a big mouth. Oh, and I'd say something like, why doesn't somebody do something about this? And somebody said, you've got a big mouth, why don't you do something about it? And I said, well, okay, well, then I will. But I know nothing about smoking in those days. The only people who were doing anything about smoking in those days, anything at all, no interventions, there was no medications, there was nothing, were in fact the Seventh-day Adventists, which is how I know, as you know, I know Kevin Price from those days where they were running a 5-day program, the 5-day plan it was called. That was on the planet the only treatment, the only group that were doing anything about smoking at all. We're talking internationally, there was nothing. And because I looked, and we sort of started to inquire and perhaps find some research on this topic, very little was being done. There was some behavioural interventions. Of course, you probably know people by then were starting to want to get help because the evidence was building and becoming more public. And then there was the various reports, the Surgeon General's reports, the UK doctors' reports were coming out. linking smoking with cancer and lung cancer, and people really wanted to do something about it, but they actually had nowhere to go, and they had nothing that they could take, or even never occurred to anybody you could take anything for this in those days. There was, of course, there was hypnotherapy already by then, and acupuncture already by then being done, and people were accessing this and paying for it. But that's in the private arena. There were lotions and potions people could take. A lot of it unscrupulous. Most of it, no, for which there was no evidence, of course. But then again, in those days, evidence-based interventions were not as they are now. Certainly no trials. Interestingly enough, of nothing. There was no trials of anything then in those days. And then, I'm saying we, there was no we, it was really me. Thought, well, maybe we should sort of talk to smokers and see what needs to be done. And I started a smokers clinic, and literally hundreds of people came at a time, in their hundreds. So instead of opening up, a clinic where you'd imagine people sitting in a queue, outside, we couldn't do that. We used the hall, the lecture theatre at St Vincent's, filled up, hundreds of people at a lecture theatre, hearing a lecture about smoking being bad for your health, which was basically what you could do, and talk about the consequences and maybe what you could do. And there was a theory that you could wean people off. So one of my very grateful patients then at the time produced a little booklet. We ran it off together and wrote it, and gave that as a sort of strategy, how you might cut down to quit, something like that. And we had these you wrote your daily cigarette consumption, and every day you had one less. Today we wouldn't do that. We wouldn't in our right minds do that. The idea of cutting down, unless you were going to cut down to quit, isn't really valid. For those who don't know this, and some people don't, cutting down, unless you cut out, that is down at daily potentially, but cutting down, people compensate. I'm not sure if you all know what compensatory smoking is, but if I was to say to you, if you smoke 20 a day, I want you to cut down to 15 in a week and then down to 10. What we do know now, and I'm just grabbing a pen from my desk here. Some of you might, this is my surrogate cigarette. Smokers smoke them differently. Are you all aware of that? Can I ask them a question? Just say yes or no. You ever heard that smokers compensate? So if I was to say to you, smoke a weaker cigarette, what you'll do is drag harder. Instead of, just puff, puff, puff on a cigarette, which if, we've been able to measure the amount of carbon monoxide and even nicotine that they get from these cigarettes. So if I was to say, if you smoke 50 a day, you'd go, oh, that's terrible, that's shocking, that's a lot, right? So, but you could be smoking 50 a day like this, right? And that counts as 50 a day. Could be half of them, could be most of them are in the ashtray, or literally how you smoke. And this is called the topography of your smoking, topography. If I was to say to you, those who are smoking 50 a day, I want you to cut down to 25 a day, and they do that, seriously do that. A couple of days, they're down to 25 a day. Every one of them is smoked differently now. And ironically, the amount of carbon monoxide and nicotine is exactly the same as it was for 50 a day. So people compensate, and even less. So ironically, you can get down, let's just say you get down to 5 a day. 5 a day is about the minimum a smoker can do. Can't get under 5 a day, because then you're really struggling to get that dose from each one of those 5. And they'll drag hard right down to the filter, hold their breath, right? Breath holding, about breath holding with other substances people smoke. Yes, they smoke, they do this breath hold thing. Yes, you've seen people, marijuana smokers, they hold their breath, they achieve the ability to have the chemical THC or whatever it is transit across the alveolar wall. It's quicker and it's longer because you're holding your breath. So breath holding is not insignificant in smokers either. So we know that's why in those days when we said back to what we were doing, cutting down was okay for some, but for most they'd be compensating. So we wouldn't do that strategy today, certainly not globally. But we did notice that a lot of people quit. A lot of people simply got information. We did an information session, very similar to what the 5-play plan was doing, really. And once that people got information about smoking being bad for your health, they stopped smoking. And I thought, this is the best thing there is. Just tell them it's bad for you, naughty, and they'll stop. And they did, in droves. And then over the years, I'm sure all of you know this because you're all working with smokers or patients, and most people now, even if they want to stop, can't. It's not as if it's just this magic, tell them how bad it is for their health and they'll stop. So very different cohort today, very different experiences. Personally for me, it's harder to help a smoker quit for me today than it has ever been before.
So what's changed?
Harder now.
What's changed?
Well, I think those who could have quit have quit. So those spontaneous quitters, the ones who said just, oh dear, that's terrible, smoking's so bad, I'll never do it again, and never do it again, that's great. They don't exist really anymore. The ones who are doing this in the face of everything that's contrary to their best interests, right, are heavily dependent. So we now see, I believe, heavily dependent smokers. I'll just put the kids out to the side a bit. Adolescent smoking is not quite the same, but adults today who smoke are pretty heavily addicted. And they've got a concomitant amount of comorbidities, mental health issues. Some of you might know 50% of all smokers today, anybody you know who smokes, half of them have a mental health component. Depression, anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder of all sorts. So we're looking at half of the people, even though it may be undiagnosed, which is important to realise. Some of our smokers today are masking their depression or anxiety by smoking. They treat it. This is self-medication with nicotine. For hopefully you know, nicotine's an extraordinary anxiolytic. Makes people a lot less anxious. It's a phenomenal antidepressant. Works in milliseconds. Best antidepressant on the market is nicotine.
Hey, you know what? I just want to diverge just for digress.
No, I'm just.
I would like to spend a lot of time talking about the strategies, and you've shared a couple of them. And then, that was the whole compensatory smoking. That was new to me, so I actually wasn't even aware of that. That smokers will draw harder if you give them less of these. So anyway, we'll come back to that. But what I find really compelling about, obviously you've got this clinic going and there are a lot of learnings because you're pioneering this, really, isn't it? I mean, the learnings as you're going through. But you've recognised that not only do you want to help those people that need the help and in terms of ceasing smoking, you actually want to start to shift the industry and make it harder for them to get access to these smokes. And so you start doing some quite innovative things on helping to support that. Now I've dug up this little image here that I found. I'm going to share my screen for a moment, and then I'll let you comment on this one. So here we go. Can everyone see this image here?
Oh, gosh, yes.
So let me just, if you can't read the fine detail, let me just explain. So this is. It looks, on first glance, you think that's a pack of cigarettes, that's Marlboro, but it's not. It's the Marlboro, and you see the writing up the top here. It's a suicide pack, and the little brief here is down the bottom. I'll read it for you. It says, Mr. Frank C. of Darlinghurst in Sydney is a lifetime smoker. Due to an operation, namely a tracheotomy, he now smokes through a hole in his neck. Right, so this Frank is smoking through his tracheotomy. Frank is and I'll get you, Renee, to explain what this means in just a moment, but the acronym is Bugger Up, B-U-G-A-U-P. Frank is Bugger Up's entrant in the $25,000 Philip Morris's Marlborough Man competition. Someone they describe as having a strong and distinctly individual masculinity, that unique difference that personalises the flavour of Marlborough. So do you think Frank will win? So, Renee, can you share with us the story behind this? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think this is
okay. Well, that's a real man, Frank, and you'll notice he was in Darlinghurst meeting a patient at St Vincent's Hospital, my patient. And what happened was Philip Morris put out this competition, a real competition, and they had a cutout of the Marlborough Man on, with his saddle over his shoulder, and the idea is, cowboy-looking, masculine-looking man, and the idea was Philip Morris was looking at the Australian version of the Marlborough Man. We're going to have a competition. $25,000 was a lot. This is in 1984, if I'm not mistaken, 1984. So I was with a colleague, some of you might know, Simon Chapman, in public health, and we thought. And I thought, I've got just the person. I just know this man. And it's true. And we had him signed off, validated that he'd smoked Marlborough all his life. The surgeon, Prof. Lord, I'll never forget that, Prof. Lord had done the tracheotomy. So, his Marlborough fitted exactly in the trachea tube. It's like a tight fit, which is pretty horrid if you think about it. But easy to then suck in from it, and he really was in a wheelchair, and that's exactly how he came. And anyway, we had him all signed off, and we entered him into this competition. Now, Philip Morris, you saw that triangle over the company. Philip Morris went berserk over this to start with, but we entered this man anyway. And we put up posters next to the Philip Morris advertising poster, right next to it. And when the day came for judging, we turned up with him in a wheelchair, which was in Elizabeth Street in the city. We turned up at this hotel, and they moved the actual prize giving to another sort of quieter place. Now, that wasn't the end of all of this. So I told you this. It wasn't the end at all. So this was a very interesting sort of innovative thing that people did. Bugger Up stands for Billboard Utilising Graffitiists Against Unhealthy Products. People did things like spray billboards and rewrite them and joke about them. It was really an innovative and very active group of very few people, I might add, not a lot of people involved in it. A lot of people now say, oh, I was in Buck. No, you weren't. I know who was.
How did you know who they were?
How did I know?
Don't answer that.
That they weren't. Well, we had a post office box, and I had the key to the post office box. But what's probably for us really interesting, doing this sort of really as activists, that's what really were health activists, was I got a phone call from the editor of the Medical Journal of Australia, and he rang me and said, I'm new to Australia, I'm here from the United States, and I'm the new editor of the Medical Journal of Australia, and I heard about you and what has been done with the Marlborough Man, and that's just fantastic. How about you write an article about it? So I did. I wrote an article for the Medical Journal of Australia. And that picture of Frank Curran, was on the front cover of the Medical Journal of Australia, where the inside had an article about it that I'd written, how successful this, activity really was. It was really a big success, really, because they really could not do anything, Philip Morris, but downplay the actual prize giving. Nobody remembers who won. Everybody remembers Frank, which was the whole idea, right? So as the Medical Journal of Australia is going to press. A letter comes from Philip Morris to the AMA saying, hold the press, you're breaching copyright using that red triangle above Frank. You're breaching copyright. And the Medical Journal of Australia started biting its nails, and the AMA started biting their nails. Oh my gosh, this has never happened to us ever before, that the Medical Journal has ever been held up. And so we had a meeting, we had some legal people and had a meeting, and the decision was there was no breach of copyright. In fact, it was just an intimidating sort of legal letter from Philip Morris, which they tend to do, try it on. So we then published the journal went ahead. The following journal, we published the letter that Philip Morris sent to the AMA, just to show how they could intimidate. Wow. And that we weren't up for intimidation. So that was extraordinary. And might I add today, things have not changed very much. Philip Morris continues to do this sort of thing all the time. They continue still today. It's jaw-dropping for me to see this revisited all this time later, and it's got to do with vaping. So, you know, my view, you probably get it now by now already, that I'm not in favour of vaping at all. So why is Philip Morris sending intimidating letters or interesting letters to various groups? It's very interesting and very, as I said, very reminding, very reminiscent for me of the 1980s. Almost identical. Recruiting people who look very credible to say positive things about. This is a recruitment from Philip Morris, just what they used to do.
Wow. Hey, you know what? Why I wanted to share that story, I think it just gives everyone here a bit of an insight as to the get up and go that you have.
No, it wasn't just me. It was a lot of people. I mean, not a lot, but very interesting people who have really committed, very committed. And they weren't all in health, not everybody, but a lot of people were. And
so really from the very early days of this smoking cessation movement, you've been not only sort of in the clinical interface there trying to work on, you know, developing, understanding, learning more about the strategies that work for people, but also this you know, activist arm, which I find really, really quite inspiring. But let's talk in the time we've got. Obviously, you've got so much that you could share with us. What are some of the? I mean, you've shared one already. This whole idea that, you know, compensatory smoking, which many of us are not aware of, which sort of highlights, and maybe you want to start by fleshing out this idea that the whole idea of just slowing down versus stopping entirely, you know, the merits of that. But what are some other key things that we need to know about helping people in this whole cessation space?
Well, primarily what we've learned over the decades is that the interactions between, you know, the evidently common, what people might consider to be props, being caffeine is one of them. This is tea, by the way. Caffeine and alcohol. Why people in the past have always made these associations, really strong ones, between these two substances, we now know a great deal more about. And keep in mind, it's not a glass of milk, it's not a glass of orange juice. It is universally around the world, alcohol and caffeine. These are, you know, water doesn't turn you on to have a cigarette, but caffeine and alcohol particularly do. So the question you want to ask is why these two substances chemically have these interactions. So again, people, as I said, they think it's convivial or it's social. You can get animal models where you've got a rat self-administering caffeine and will self-administer nicotine 3 times faster. And alcohol being the same. So there are obviously concomitant, there are effects that are synergistic in the brain of these particular substances. But I think I'm I'm going to allude to something else that you may or may not know. I do know a little bit about your backgrounds, but and I know that most of them are medical or
We've got
health.
so we've got a variety of health professions.
For those who don't know this, when you smoke a cigarette, not only do you produce carbon monoxide, the gas, and obviously extract nicotine, but there's another chemical that's really important that are called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. For those who don't know what they are, you probably do know what they are. They're the charcoal that if you burn your steak. I've just got a signal that says my internet. If my internet conks out, it's because it's Philip Morris doing it to me. I'm not paranoid. But in case it goes, I always tell people it's the tobacco. They're sabotaging. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are chemicals that you produce when you burn your steak. You know how you're not supposed to have a lot of it because it's carcinogenic? It's that charcoal.
Mm.
But in gas phase, it's partly what makes the cigarette smoke grey. It's not white, it's grey. And so you're producing this gas because you're burning an organic material. Organic material, when you burn any organic material, will produce carbon monoxide and these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs they're called. So when you inhale them, they're in gas phase, right? You will, in fact, they will transfer into your bloodstream, to your liver, and this is what's called an induction. Have we got any pharmacists in the room? Not sure.
I don't think we've got any pharmacists. We've got
pharmacists, because this is a bit of their bread and butter. Pharmacists know about induction of enzymes. So this is a liver induction effect. When you inhale these PAHs, it induces liver enzymes. The most potent enzyme that it induces is a liver enzyme, one of those CYP liver enzyme. Do I need to P450 CYP liver enzyme type 1A2? Just mention to you, 2A6 metabolizes nicotine, 1A2 metabolizes caffeine. So if you're stimulating the metabolism of caffeine when you smoke, what does that mean you have to do when you drink coffee? Question to you.
So there we go. Just up, Belle's putting her hand up.
Yes, Belle?
Oh, no, she's going, no, not me.
What happens if you are going to induce an enzyme?
I was going to say you have to drink more.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. You need to. So all our smokers drink 4 or 5 cups of coffee to your 1. Smokers drink a huge amount more caffeine. So it's an induction of this enzyme. Unfortunately, that same enzyme tends to affect many medications. Does anybody know which ones I mean? Have you heard this before?
Anyone can jump in.
Jump in. What medication is affected if you smoke? There's a whole list of them, unfortunately, and the list gets longer every day. So you need to know this. If you're managing smokers and they're on clozapine, you've probably heard this already, yeah? Clozapine, olanzapine. We know that heparin is involved, warfarin is involved. All smokers need more of those medications. There's a list. It's on New South Wales Health Tobacco Control, it's called the Tobacco Toolkit. If you've never heard this, there is a list. This is not an insignificant thing. If a smoker quits and they're on warfarin and they're on a higher dose because they smoke, right, and they quit smoking, what's going to happen to them? They're more likely to bleed, right? Clozapine overdose, olanzapine overdose. This is in people quitting smoking. And the problem is that, of course, people have to quit when they come into hospital. So it's not a small matter. These are significant things. But it affects, as I said, caffeine, and that's the one people understand most. What if I went on drinking the same amount of caffeine I always had, and I've stopped smoking? You get the jitters. You get a bit of caffeine overdose. And how's this? I'm wearing a classic response. I'm wearing a nicotine patch to not smoke, and it's going brilliantly, but gosh, they give me the jitters. I can't sleep at night. The question you want to ask is, how much caffeine are you drinking? Oh, they say the same as before. What was that? How much was that? Oh, 5 cups of coffee and 3 litres of Coca-Cola every day. You've got to factor in the caffeine, all of their caffeine, and tell smokers to reduce it by half. Not to eliminate it, because they will have caffeine withdrawals, because 40% of caffeine users get caffeine withdrawals. So the irony here is you've got to negotiate this, but talk about it and ask, how much coffee do you drink, or caffeinated drinks? And you will fall off your chair when you hear how much caffeinated drink there is. Not just a cup of coffee, Red Bull, right? All the energy drinks that have got caffeinated drinks. And you'll see people with a Red Bull in one hand and a cigarette in the other. That's pretty typical. Always ask, and you don't have to eliminate it, just tone it down. The other interesting one, if you're asking about interesting ones, Darren, is alcohol. So smoking also induces alcohol dehydrogenase. And you all know what that does. Yes? Are you all nodding yes? You all know what alcohol dehydrogenase, that breaks down alcohol for you. I'm not a big drinker. I can't drink. I don't have a lot of alcohol dehydrogenase. The effect is a little bit of alcohol makes me drunk. I don't produce a lot of alcohol, which is great for my husband because he drinks the rest of the bottle, right? Because he can do it. I can't do it. It's got nothing to do with age. It's got to do with my liver enzymes. There are whole groups of people, I'm sure you know, in Southeast Asia, not a lot of alcohol dehydrogenase, which means people get that flushed look, the feeling of not being able to drink. Doesn't mean they don't like getting drunk. It just doesn't take a lot to do that, right? A little bit of alcohol will do it for me. That's it. So smokers, if you induce alcohol dehydrogenase, what does that mean? Well, it's the same effect like caffeine. You're going to be a big drinker. You're going to drink 3 or 4 times what non-smokers, or what you would do if you were not smoking. So smokers don't know that, and they don't know. This is why the pubs and clubs are so opposed to banning smoking. Right? You ban smoking, and the punters who go into the clubs and the pubs will drink a lot less for the same blood alcohol level. You just don't need as much. And they know it. They say, I'm a cheap drunk. I can't do it anymore. I don't drink as much and they think it's got to do with the conviviality of the two in the hand, one in one hand, one. It's actually got to do with the physiology of this. I don't need as much alcohol for the same effect. So this is really important for people who are drinkers. If you want to address their drinking, and that's what we're currently doing in our drug and alcohol services, in our detox units, saying if you want to address the substances that you're using and abusing, and this is across the board, almost everything is affected. All the substances, the illicits, are affected by smoking. You will use less if you don't smoke. It's the PAHs. It's not nicotine. It's not a nicotine effect. We try to make that very clear. This is not nicotine. So that's an interesting one of them. Can I give you one other interesting one, I think? And that is to do with nicotine itself. I mentioned that nicotine is metabolized by one liver enzyme type 2A6. There are a whole range of these types. 2A6 ranges from 1 to about 12 that we know about. Meaning, if you've got liver enzyme type 2A6 type 1, that you might be a slow metabolizer metabolizer of nicotine, and I might be a fast metabolizer. This is a liver enzyme I am born with. There are whole groups of people who are born with these liver enzyme types, right? Like the 1A2 I was talking, or the alcohol dehydrogenase I was talking about. You're born with these enzyme types. You can stimulate them. But if I'm born with 2A6 and I'm a slow metabolizer of nicotine, I don't have to smoke as much as somebody who's a fast metabolizer. And fast metabolizers, unfortunately, are much more prone to lung cancer because of it. It's not a direct relationship, it's a numbers thing. You've got to smoke more because you're excreting it quickly. Most smokers have no idea about this. There are whole, as I said, groups of people like we know Southeast Asia low on alcohol dehydrogenase. Well, we now know, for example, the Turks, famous for being fast metabolizers of nicotine. Anybody here in the group got patients from around the Middle East? If you've seen patients smoking from the Middle East, they smoke like it's going out of style, right? Big numbers of cigarettes. Don't go, oh, their life is really difficult and it's, you know, they've got a tough life and you live in Lebanon and it's tough, which is true. However, you've probably got this liver enzyme that's churning it up too. And higher rates of lung cancer in the Middle East because of it. North Africa. So it does actually matter who you're seeing. Whether, for example, if they're Japanese, the Japanese are slower metabolizers of nicotine. Even though many Japanese smoke, right? Japanese prevalence of smoking is incredibly high. But they don't smoke a lot. A lot of them smoke, but they don't smoke a lot. They don't need to do a lot of cigarettes per day because it keeps circulating. The nicotine keeps circulating. So does this matter? It does. People who are fast excreters need more NRT, for example, much more nicotine replacement therapy because they're excreting it really quickly. So we know that. And so it does matter who's sitting in front of you. It does matter what they're smoking. I do things like, for example, I ask a lot about their prior history of using pharmacotherapies because these pharmacotherapies seem to be genetically, or the efficacies are genetically determined. So if you've used patches and they didn't work, you want to ask, what does that mean they didn't work? And often it's things like, I smoked as well. Well, we know that most of those nicotine replacement therapies, and I have no conflicts of interest, better say that straight away. I don't work for any of the drug companies. I'm not on their boards of, consultancy boards or anything like that. Can't do that, and I won't do that. So I can easily say more NRT, not less. We've now got good evidence, 3-4 patches at a time, not one. If you smoke while you're wearing a patch, it's really common. The doses are too low. Underdosing is a big problem with NRT. It's the biggest problem we've had more recently. Initially, keep in mind, those who could have quit using a patch and they quit, that's great. Now our clients, our patients today would be wearing one patch and it's sort of a bit like water off a duck's back. They might smoke less. They certainly don't drag like they would have like I mentioned before. If you smoke less using patches, that's safer than smoking less without wearing one. Yes?
Wow. Hey, Salim.
You know what I mean? What I'm getting. If you use NRT and still smoke, it's safer than not using NRT and smoking.
Yeah.
You're not going to do that hard drag anymore.
Yes.
Right. And so ironically, you've got a background of some nicotine and you will not drag as hard. And we've tested this. We know it. There's many, many publications on this. There's much less compensatory smoking when you use NRT, which is good because that's, for us, a gateway to quitting.
Yes. Hey, so I'll ask you one question, then I'd love to open it up, and because I'm sure some others have got some questions. A number of years ago, I used to do some work in prisons, running sort of wellness programs in prisons, and then in rehabilitation centres. And what always fascinated me about them is they, most of the guys were either off to AA or NA or gambling, GA, and yet smoking, they were just prolific smokers. And I remember that I have this ironic moment. So I remember I'd run a fitness program for a group of guys from a local prison when I was down in Victoria at a university there, and they would come out to the university. They had special leave to do this, and they'd have the guards with them, and they'd be in their greens, And before they all came into the doors to do this exercise session with me, I just remember them, they'd all be there with their cigarettes, just getting the last little remnant out before they had to head into this to go and do their workout, and then throw the things out, and I'd walk out, all right, come, let's go, guys, and they'd all come inside. What's your thoughts? And look, in fact, I did some locally. We have a drug and alcohol rehabilitation centre, and I've run some fitness programs for some guys there. And once again, they're smoking. They're very dependent. Like, I don't think I met one person that didn't smoke there, but all the other, drugs and substances are not allowed. What's your thinking on that? Because their take was, hey, you know what? We have to give them something. They need.
Gosh, no. That's appalling. My view on this is the most likely drug to kill them is nicotine. It's not going to be any of the illicits. The most you all know that. I don't think we need to remind people. Alcoholics die of smoking-related diseases, not of alcohol-related disease. Smokers die alcoholics die. Almost all drug, this drug overdose story we're hearing now. I don't want to be rude about this, and every drug death is appalling, of course. But the numbers are nothing like the numbers from smoking. We're looking at in Australia today, 15,000 a year. 15,000, that's a township a year, not anything less. And we're looking at drugs in terms of the hundreds, right? Nothing like the thousands. So in terms of the reality check is, if you want to do something for the health of that person, you really need to address their smoking. And of course, there are ways now we can do that. Like I was just saying, this gateway to quitting is not a small thing. If you can advise in that facility where you go that everybody wears a patch, you don't want to wear a patch, put it on anyway. You don't have to quit. This is why I tell people, put on a patch and smoke anyway. See you later. Just don't say quit. Don't say stop smoking. Don't even use the language. We're using this new language called managing your smoking. So it softens the approach. So if you put a patch on somebody, and I'm only saying patches because of compliance, it's easy to put it on. You don't have to take any gum or use the lozenges or use these products. You can, that's fine. But if you just put a patch on and smoke anyway, it starts something happening. What it starts is, not only are we delivering, remember, extremely low doses of nicotine. The biggest patch, don't even think about, you're listening to me, don't think about using weak patches. There's no relationship, right, between numbers per day and patch strength. That's unfortunately a myth that the drug companies who make this have perpetrated, and they know it. Nobody uses weak doses for anything at all, ever. None of those patients should be on a weak. I only smoke 7 a day, therefore I should wear a weak patch. No. We all know patients compensate, so we won't do that. You put on a patch, and if you the 21 milligram, the strongest one, 24/7, ideally for those who are interested, just before you go to sleep at night. Does anybody know what happens? Patches take hours to work, often 6-8 hours. You look at the patient information sheets, you'll see that nobody reads these things, right? Or the instructions. Nobody reads the details. Patches take 6 to 8 hours to work. Most of our patients wake up in the morning and need a cigarette immediately. Immediately, not an hour from now. Now. And why is it now? Because they've excreted most of it. Remember, it's in their bladder. They've metabolized the lot, and they wake up in the morning. And remember, nicotine's a neurotransmitter substance. For them, it's like your acetylcholine. Acetylcholine does for you what nicotine does for them. You wake up, you're producing more, and you start to wake up, right? And you're using it for brain function. Now, unfortunately, they use, and we know this has happened, they use nicotine for brain function, and it really has usurped acetylcholine. That's what nicotine receptors do. That's why they're called nicotine acetylcholine receptors. That's why they're called that. It's what they do. Nicotine gets in there and replaces acetylcholine really well. Bummer. So you wake up in the morning and I can't function without nicotine, right? So I've got to have my very first cigarette immediately. If I put a patch on tonight before I go to sleep, when I wake up in the morning, I've got at least a dose of nicotine that stops me from having that very first one. Or at least it retards it. It puts it back maybe 10 minutes, maybe half an hour. It changes the behaviour. So we're looking at behavioural changes using pharmacotherapies, which are very interesting because they automatically change. Just do this with a patient or somebody you know. Put a patch on before you go to sleep at night. Oh, it'll keep me awake. No, it won't. It's because you put them on in the morning that they keep you awake at night because they're peaking at night, right? They take hours to peak. And we're talking peaking in levels of maybe a quarter of a cigarette. The strongest patch delivers extremely low doses of nicotine. Most of the nicotine is in the patch when you throw it out at the end of the 24 hours, in the bin. You need a gradient for nicotine to go across the skin. So most people don't know. Your pharmacists, sorry to say this about pharmacists, they haven't got a clue. They wouldn't know this, right? All they know is what's written there. If you smoke so many cigarettes a day, this is what the strength is. Wrong. All of that's wrong. We're trying to re-educate them and trying to change the drug companies or the pharmacotherapy companies that make these treatments not to instruct people erroneously. So a patch on just before you go to sleep at night changes the dynamics in the morning, and people can smoke as well. And what we know now is that when you're using these nicotine products, even gums, because they're slow release and low dose, it changes the formation of nicotine acetylcholine receptors. Receptors are made literally in your mitochondria, in your neurons. That's where you make them, the mitochondria. And they are stimulated by, well, as far as we know now, by nicotine, in a sense, covering the neuron fleetingly. So what I'm getting at is there is a big difference between nicotine smoked, inhaled, right? This is interarterial nicotine. This is not, this beats injecting nicotine, right? Remember, this is intravenous. This is interarterial, through your arterial blood, right through your alveolar wall, straight into your arterial blood, bypasses the venous system. There's nothing better than smoking a cigarette, or at least inhaling the nicotine, so that, hence the vaping story is trying to get a vape that mimics the delivery of nicotine via the alveolus, really. That's the agenda, trying to make this equipment that will mimic a cigarette being burnt, and a volatile nicotine. So you're inhaling it, it's going straight into your arterial blood, and that's a shot of nicotine. It's not a slow release, it's a shot. Shots of nicotine stimulate the brain receptors, stimulate the production of nicotine acetylcholine receptors. So if we're giving some nicotine that's not a shot, low dose, slow release nicotine, what we now know is it doesn't stimulate receptors. You're sort of giving patients some nicotine. There's no shot, there's no up and there's no down. Remember, when you inhale, nicotine hits the brain and then it wears off. Excuse me. Nicotine lasts about, well, anybody know what the half-life of nicotine is? I'll put it to you.
I'm Matt. Are you pointing at me?
I am, Darren.
Oh.
Why you? Because I think I told you this.
Oh no, this is bad. Well, look, my gut.
It's gone all red. Have you noticed it?
Yeah. Was are there different, like, you've already explained, like, for example, alcohol dehydrogenase, that you got fast metabolism of alcohol, of caffeine. Is it the same with nicotine? Do you have some people that take, the peak period of time?
So 2A6, the type you've got.
Yeah.
So if it lasts longer in your body, you're right. So how long? let's just give it an average. And the reason why I'm saying this is because it's a bit of an eye-opener to our patients who have absolutely no idea about this. They're smoking a cigarette, you get a peak of nicotine and then it decays. How long does it take for nicotine to decay?
All right, Dr.
2 hours. Very good.
Is it? Oh, she's better than me. I was
Yes.
thinking.
That's sort of right. It can be shorter. That's long. 2 hours is long.
Yeah, I would have thought, I was going to say about half an hour.
So it can be 40 minutes.
Right, okay.
There's a range, right? So if you're a fast metabolizer, it's going to be excreted quickly. And if it's a slow one, it's going to be 2 hours for me.
Yeah.
Which means I smoke less.
Yes.
Right? But I recalled speaking to you about this, why cigarettes are packaged in a box, but in a pack of 20 to 25 in a pack. Because that's the half-life of nicotine divided by your 18-hour waking day.
Wow.
It's not any more sophisticated than that. And you tell that to smokers and they feel so manipulated. So every cigarette is in the box as a dose, but because the last one's worn off and you need a next one.
Now
so 2 hours.
Size packs though too, aren't there? Are they?
Well, no, we're not allowed to have 50 in a pack anymore.
Right.
We're not allowed. No. But even those, they're weaker nicotine. So have you noticed that the weaker the nicotine, the more you're going to need? So weak cigarettes.
I wonder. This is fact. I mean, I could listen to this, and I do really want to allow opportunity for someone to ask a few questions. Just to touch on that point though, I didn't know about that, so my brain must have already been overloaded when you told me that fact the other day. But there's also a psychology to completing something. Like there's like if it's like a biscuit pack. If there's 2 biscuits left at the end of it, you're thinking, that would be wrong. That would go against all that is right and proper, not to eat those 2.
That's right. There is some work on that. I think that's called, but there's also that what's called the AVE, abstinence violation effect. Have you ever heard of that? AVE is, it's literally a piece of cake, and you're on a diet, and you'll just have a sliver of it, and then you think, oh, what the heck? I've had a little bit, I might as well have the lot. That's called, you're violating your abstinence, right? It's called the AVE, the abstinence violation effect. Yeah. And so people are suggesting that maybe smokers have that as well. I promised myself I won't. And then I have one and what, no, now I've blown it. What the heck? I might as well,
Yeah.
Have I done something technically that I shouldn't have done?
Right, it's all good. Let's open up. So let's.
How does vape? I can see a question.
Okay. Well, maybe. Look, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask the question live if you want. But Amanda's got a question there.
Yes, I saw that, Amanda. How does a vape? Well, the whole principle behind vaping is trying to get nicotine into the bloodstream, as you would, from a cigarette. The idea, the closer it gets to looking like it's doing that, the more, unfortunately, dependence producing it is. So remember that most smokers the agenda is nicotine to the brain. So is it safer to vape? We have a dilemma with this right now, remembering it's only been about 10 years. There's no carbon monoxide. I think we know that. That's correct. However, we've now noticed that there are PAHs in vaping. How that's come about, nobody's privy to how this happens. That is, to the technology behind this. Keep in mind there's all sorts of vaping apparati out there. And so we don't know one technology is better than the other, but the idea and the agenda is to get nicotine looking or mimicking the delivery of like a cigarette. So there's no carbon monoxide, so we know that. Particulate matter is limited, so we know that too. Not a lot of particles are entering into the lungs. However, the big but, with a double T, the big but right now is the flavourings and the carrier. What's carrying the nicotine? You've probably heard of the propylene glycol that's carrying the nicotine. Whether that's causing some of the respiratory side effects. All of us have concerns about the flavourings. I'm sure you know that flavourings are meant to be ingested, and that they are approved for ingestion, but they are not necessarily approved for inhalation. Not at all approved for inhalation. I understand the most common flavouring being used out there. You all know that there are thousands of flavours. You can buy hamburger flavoured. You can buy, chocolate flavoured. But the most common flavour bought online that we're aware of is vanilla. And vanilla seems to have vanilla extract, which is supposed to be okay if you eat it, but not really great if you inhale it. So the problem has been with the concerns about what that vanilla flavouring might do to the lungs, the lining of the lung. There's popcorn lung. Have you heard about this one at all? Anybody heard about popcorn lung? Yes? Why it's called popcorn lung? Doug, I can see your partner says, yes, she's heard about popcorn lung. Hi. It's not because the lungs become popcorn. It's because of the popcorn workers. So about 10 or 15 decades ago, so this is decades ago, people were working in a factory covering corn with vanilla flavouring that you would then go and pop at the cinema. You know how you go to the cinema and they're popping corn? That's covered with vanilla flavouring. So the people who were doing that flavouring covering in a factory, there was vape coming off the flavouring, and they developed these terrible respiratory diseases called alveolitis obliterans. Obliterans, right? The alveolus would break open and it would obliterate. That's what it's called, obliterans. And that was then called popcorn lung, because in fact it looked like the lungs, all those little air sacs had popped. But it was called popcorn lung because of the popcorn workers. Fast forward 2010, the first cases of popcorn lung reappear when people are vaping vanilla-flavoured vaping. And so there's been a reappearance of what's called popcorn lung. Now this pneumonitis, alveolitis, looks like pneumonitis and alveolitis is appearing in the States. Have you heard about that? There's more than 1,000 cases and obviously there have been some deaths. We don't know exactly why it's only been, I don't think there are only presentations in the United States. The problem with these young kids developing this is that they're asked if they vape. A lot of people don't ask what people are doing. They present with a really serious case of pneumonia and it's assumed they've got a serious case of pneumonia. Nobody asks, do you smoke? A lot of people don't ask. Some of you might know that once upon a time, about 10 years ago now, I discovered this inhalation of mould from mouldy tobacco in Australia, from cheap, literally homegrown moulding tobacco. Are you all aware that homegrown tobacco can mould? That's not to say we want people to smoke ordinary cigarettes, but moulding is a serious concern. And because people don't ask, what are you smoking? They ask, do you smoke, which is great, tick a box, right? Fantastic. But they don't ask, what are you smoking? It matters what you're smoking. If you smoke homegrown tobacco and you present with a pneumonia, I want to look at that tobacco because it's often mouldy. So we've had, some of you might know the mould in the lung called aspergillosis. Ever heard of aspergillosis? We've had deaths related to this, but most people don't put the connection there. They don't ask. A patient presents with aspergillosis or presents with alveolitis. We have lots of cases of allergic reactions to mould. And this is in homegrown tobacco, which is illegal in Australia, by the way. As we mentioned, you can't grow tobacco in Australia. It's illegal to grow at home. To even have your own pot in the backyard is illegal. And if you don't dry it properly, it will mould. And people smoke mouldy tobacco. By the way, you can get this from marijuana smoking as well if it moulds. Anything that clumps together, anybody's seen marijuana smoking, the marijuana's clumpy, it's mould that's making it stick together. Don't dry it in the microwave, which they do. Throw it away, because drying it in the microwave, these are called thermophilic spores. The mould loves the warmth and heat of the microwave, so they actually grow more. It's worse for you. Don't let people do that. Just throw the whole batch away. But we've seen dreadful moulding reactions from what was called chop, if you remember the term in Australia. We don't see it as much anymore because we really tried to educate everybody not to imagine that chop is in any way better for you or less harmful for you. But that's sort of what my concern with what people think is a safer form of inhaling nicotine. That doesn't necessarily mean it is. I don't think personally that nicotine's benign either, and everybody does. Well, not everybody. A lot of people think, who are proposing, vaping as being safe, imagining that nicotine's benign. I don't think it's benign, and I certainly don't think it's benign in people with mental health concerns, and half of our smokers have them.
Yes.
So stimulating nicotine receptors, having nicotine withdrawals. There is no evidence that that nicotine for some reason might be advantageous to somebody with mental health illnesses. What we know is that our smokers do much better of any smoking, do much better of any mental illness, much better if they don't smoke.
Yeah, it's interesting to say that. I think in the lifestyle medicine space, there's often a lot of talk about caffeine and the potential impact of that on cardiovascular disease. And it's quite contentious. Some people actually argue that some caffeine might be beneficial, but they never talk about mental health. And I think that there's some serious concerns in that space. I want to be respectful to your time. And look, what I would love to tell everyone. And if anyone's got one last question I'd like to ask after I've sort of said this, feel free to ask it. But Renee, we've been chatting a bit, and we'd actually love to one day actually run a seminar here at Avondale as a bit of a residential program. Renee's running programs all the time. I think did you say you're in Fiji? You're doing one in Fiji today?
No. I was at a conference on the Oceania conference and talking about what we can do in Fiji next year. Yes.
Right. Because I know Dr. Partey, who's in our group,
yes.
It must be tomorrow, and he mentioned to me that he was looking forward to hearing from you. So look, there's obviously so much that we could learn here, and I know we're just scratching the surface in terms of your understandings and knowledge and experience. But maybe I'll give the opportunity now. Is anyone got one last question I'd like to ask before we tie it up, and then I'll conclude.
Georgia's got a hand up.
Okay, Georgia, go for it. You've got the last say.
Hang on, just unmute. Hi, Renee. How are you? Yeah, look, thanks for tonight. It's great. Just learnt so much information that I didn't know about. But look, a little bit off track. Obviously, you've worked with the model of tobacco and avoiding it. I'm just thinking about the sugar model, the sugar tax and avoiding sugars. I'm just wondering if you're involved in that or will be, or what are your thoughts about all of that?
It's really an expertise I don't have in and I understand exactly what you're saying. And honestly, I haven't really put my mind to the sugar tax and the behaviours around using and the industry. Of course, all of these are incredibly similar, aren't they? as is the alcohol industry, frankly. And personally, I would have liked to have seen more advocacy for the sort of activities that we had, activist activities with regard to the alcohol industry. I just, you still are, as I am, I'm sure, amazed to see advertising for alcohol everywhere, right? Which is not quite the same as sugar. I've put my mind more to the alcohol industry and saying, you know, the similarities are huge, and the devastation that it wreaks is huge. The alcohol industry. I'd like to see much more activity with alcohol, but you're right, absolutely. That well, there you are. Here's a challenge.
There's a challenge. See now, Georgia. What was it? What'd you say? It was 1967 that Renee was said, "Hey, you go do something about it." So, Georgia, there's your challenge. You know, Gary, we had Gary Egger with us last week, Renee, and
Oh, did you?
And obviously, always great to hear from him. And he actually mentioned the quote by Gandhi, or apparently attributed to Gandhi, where he says, "You know, first they ignore you, and then they laugh at you, and then they fight you, but then you win." And I love the optimism of that. And you know, I think that what George has alluded to is so true, that within a lot of the, you know, we see it happening now with regards to nutrition as an example, but it needs to happen in other areas as well. Really, the smoking, what you guys have done in the smoking space is probably 3 decades ahead, you know, and we see the exact same patterns starting to emerge in terms of, you know, changing nutrition patterns at a population level and the like. So anyway, look, we're going to wrap it up here, because I know that, you know, as I said, you could talk about this for days, and we'd love to hear more about it. But hey, I personally just really want to thank you for what you do. I can only imagine, you know, we talk about DALYs, you know, the disability adjusted life years. You know, if we did a tally of the impact that you'd had in that space over the years, it would be just astronomical. And so, you know, it's a real privilege for us to be able to hear from someone of your level of expertise and your caring. And so I just want to really thank you for the work that you do. And so keep up the good work. Keep up the good fight, because, you know, as Gandhi says, then you will win.
And you.
So yeah, it's really good hearing from you. Thank you for being with us. And yeah, we hope to be able to.
I hope to see you all. Yeah, that'd be lovely.
All right, I am going.
Good night, everybody. Do we just turn our